Hello, my writer friends. Welcome to Write with Intent. I'm Mindy Arnett, science fiction and fantasy author, bringing you all the tips, tricks, and tools of the trade that I have learned on my publication journey to help you on yours. Today, we're talking about query letters. So let's get started. Okay, guys. A couple weeks ago, we talked about finding an agent and all the reasons why you want one. And we talked a little bit about how you're going to approach them and some of the things they're going to ask for, including a synopsis and the query letter. Well, today I'm going to break down the query letter for you because it is something that you might end up writing multiple times, actually. And it's the most important tool as far after writing the good book. So, rule number one on finding an agent is write a good book, one that's edited and revised and ready to go. And then the very next part of that is to write a really awesome query letter. Even if you're planning on meeting an agent in person, having the query letter under your belt and having is a good tool to have, primarily because it requires you to break down your story into its simplest and most exciting parts. So the query letter, I like to think of them very often as kind of the blurb that you would see on the back of a book, specifically the paperback books. And actually, I think I have one right here. So this is a really old paperback, but as you can see, there is a 3-paragraph summary of what the book's about that's designed to entice you to read it. Oftentimes, what's on the back of a paperback is a little bit shorter than what you'll find on the front flap of a hardback. So I kind of recommend, as you're preparing to write your query letter, to kind of look at backs of paperbacks to get an idea a little bit of how to start them. So there are 4 elements to your query letter that should be included. Part 1 is the story pitch, which of course is the most important part. The second part is your word count and your genre. Part 3 is comparison titles, and part 4 is your bio. Now, to be fair, not all 4 of those have to be included, but I'll kind of talk about why you want to include these 4 things. You can, of course, skip over the comparison titles, but again, let me just break that down one by one to tell you what's going on. So let's actually start with an example. I'm going to share with you the query letter that I wrote my agent several years ago on my book, The Nightmare Affair. 16-year-old Dusty Everhart might make a regular habit of breaking into houses late at night, but she is no criminal. She is a nightmare, a magical being who must feed on the dreams of others, and in doing so, experience those dreams too. But when her latest dreamer, Eli Booker, the hot guy from her old high school, turns out to be dreaming about a murder which shortly comes true, she goes from non-criminal to reluctant crime fighter. Dusty learns that together she and Eli possess the rare ability to predict the future through dreams. They are soon enlisted by the Magic Kind government to help identify the person killing students at Dusty's high school, Arkwell Academy, a secret school for Magic Kind. Now Dusty and Eli must follow the clues both within Eli's dreams and out of them to stop the killer before more people turn up dead, and before the killer learns what they're up to and marks them as their next target. Complete at 76,400 words, The Nightmare Affair is a YA contemporary fantasy which I like to think of as Veronica Mars meets Hex Hall. Per your submission guidelines, I have included the first 5 pages and a synopsis below. My short stories have appeared in various semi-pro magazines, including Happy, and I have received an honorable mention in the year's Best Fantasy and Horror 2008. I have a Master of Arts in English Literature with an emphasis in creative writing. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for your time and consideration. Now, of course, this is not the whole letter because of space. Only so much I can fit on a screen. But, it starts off with the agent's name. So in the letter that I have sent to Susie would have been Dear Susie Townsend. And then it goes right into the pitch. And then it talks about the specifics of the story. So the word count and the genre. And then I include the bio. And then, sincerely. And then, of course, my contact information below that. And I'll go ahead and, if I can provide, I have a link of this on my website. So if you want to look down in the show notes, you can go over there and find a copy of this on the website. So you have your own copy to look at and build off when you go to build your query letter. So I'm going to skip over the story pitch part for now because we're going to delve into that in a little bit. And let's talk about kind of the word count and the genre goals or the genre type and why, and the comparison titles and why you want to include those. So the word count, you may already know about them and you may not, but all books have kind of a threshold for what their story lengths usually are. So if you're writing a middle grade, the threshold tends to be shorter than if you're writing an adult fantasy per se. So like if you looked at the word count of a J.R.R. Martin novel, it's going to be upwards of 180,000 words, 200,000 words easily, if not more. I honestly don't know how long those are. So there's a huge spectrum of lengths, and what the word count is going to tell the agent is whether or not your story is meeting kind of that minimum threshold goal for whatever you're trying to publish in. So these word counts are somewhat arbitrary, because there's a big range in them, but there are kind of, like I said, those minimum thresholds. So I'm not going to share those today because honestly, I don't know what they are anymore. I haven't written this type of query letter in a number of years. But you should go out there and do a Google search and look for some websites where they talk about what word length should be depending on what you're writing. If you're writing an adult fantasy, I can guarantee you your word count's going to be 100,000 or more. Most of my young adult fantasies that I have written have hovered in that 100,000 word range up to like 125,000 words. This book that you're reading the query for, Nightmare Affair, was very, very much, it was my first young adult, so it tended to be a little bit shorter, and is also contemporary fantasy, so not as much of the world building and heavier, denser stuff that I got into later. And actually that 76,000 words that I wrote as my initial first drafts became about 82,000, 84,000 by the time it hit publication. So your word count will change a little bit. But either way, it's very important to know what your word count is, to tell the agent what the word count is, and to make sure that your word count is in that threshold for what you're trying to publish. If it is way too long, let's say you wrote a middle grade and it's 100,000 K, most agents are going to look at that and go, probably not a solid book, because middle grade tends to be more in the 60,000, I believe, to 80,000 words at the maximum, because of course a middle grade reader doesn't have the same kind of longevity in their reading that an adult has. Now, if you of course are a published author and established, you can go way longer on your books. Like obviously Harry Potter's, are middle grade technically, but the last couple of books were really, really chunky. But you need to be established before you can actually kind of break those word count thresholds. So it's very important to know your word count, share your word count, and also use those word counts to help you in your revising and editing stage. Like if your book is way under what is normally expected for a young adult fantasy is usually 80,000 words to 100,000 words, kind of in that area. If you're coming in at like 60,000 words, I believe that most agents are going to be like, well, that's a little light. Probably the story isn't very complete. And at a minimum, I'm going to have to help them do a lot of revising. And you know what? Let's be honest. The agent doesn't want to do a lot of work to be able to sell your book. They want the book to already be pretty solid. And especially your more established agents who aren't really looking for a lot of new talent, because they don't really need a lot of new talent. Again, they're looking for the reasons to eliminate you as a possibility. So make sure that your word count is not what's going to throw them off. Now, for your genre, this is specifically the category where your book would fall if it were being looked at in a bookstore. Now, of course, I know that that's kind of a little bit daunting to think about, because honestly, brick and mortar bookstores are unfortunately going away. Hopefully, I believe they will not go away forever, but they're certainly not as big as they used to be. It might be a little bit harder, especially in COVID, to go to your local Barnes & Noble or your independent bookstore and kind of look at the bookshelves. And then you have all the books for sale on Amazon, and Amazon has a gazillion number of categories, like, I don't know, like high fantasy, heroic female, badass chicks is a category that you can be shelved in if you're publishing on Amazon. Ignore those. You need to focus on the categories that would exist, again, on the bookshelf. So is it young adult? Is it an adult? Is it middle grade? You can pare down those a little bit. So when you say young adult is a very broad category. So you could say young adult contemporary if you're writing a story that doesn't have magic or fantasy in it, or science fiction or whatever. Again, if it's a science fiction young adult, then it's a sci-fi young adult. If it's an adult also is a big category, and that's broken down on the bookshelves to fantasy, adult fantasy, adult erotica, adult romance, young adult romance. So there's so many. So know your genre. Pick the one where you think your book would live, or where you would want it to live if it were in a bookstore for someone to go be shopping and find. That's all it is for genres. So the other part, which would be number 3 that I talked about, which is the comparison titles, is not a requirement. You can get away without including them. However, I find them very useful, and I would not be afraid to say that most agents appreciate good comparison titles. And the reason for that is sometimes your pitch can come off as seeming multiple flavors to it, right? So the one I just shared about the Nightmare Affair sounds like it could be kind of dark and kind of intense. We're talking about murder and, dreams and nightmares. So, that's a very specific flavor of story. Or it could also be, there's this romance part of it. So it could be kind of light and fun and more whatever. So the comparison titles help give the agent a sense of what the story might feel like. So you want to pick titles that that represent, what you're hoping to accomplish in kind of the feel of your story. So my 2 examples, which of course are very dated at this point, were Veronica Mars, because I loved Veronica Mars. And it was about the whole detective thing. And also the really not smart, but per se, but the sarcastic, flippant, kind of funny heroine that I was trying to capture with my heroine. And then Hex Hall was a young adult contemporary fantasy that had come out in the previous months when I was writing the book that was very successful, and that I had read and enjoyed and felt like my story would appeal to readers that liked that story. So the thing about comparison titles is that, again, it helps the agent frame what the story is like, but also, let me rephrase that. But you have to make sure that the references you're using are appropriate. And there are 2 pitfalls that people fall into in comparison titles. The first one is that they will compare to books that are really, 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 really hugely popular. Like people will say, it's like Harry Potter meets Twilight meets The Hunger Games meets, some of the Shadow and Bone that just came out with Leigh Bardugo on Netflix. There's these huge titles that everybody knows and that are so big that to actually mention them it kind of makes you look like an amateur, because it would be great if your book were as good as Harry Potter. Don't get me wrong. Like, I would love for my books to be that good, but the chances are that it's probably not that good. And I don't want to create an expectation in my agent that's reading it, this book is going to be that awesome. So it's actually better, and it shows a more seasoned, writer to compare to titles that are successful but aren't like the big gangbusters that everyone knows of, and that frankly you could just compare to lazily and be like, oh yeah, like I'm like this book that everyone knows but I've actually not read it. So for your comparison titles, you need to be reading books that are coming out right now that your book could be associated with in a positive way. So if you're not currently reading the category of fiction that you're trying to publish in, you're making a mistake. And those books need to be, again, let me emphasize the word, current. Do not compare your adult fantasy to Lord of the Rings. Do not compare your adult fantasy to Game of Thrones. Both because they are hugely popular and well known and are immediately going to make you look like an amateur, but also because those books are not recent. I mean, George R.R. Martin has not published a new Game of Thrones book in 5 years, 6? I mean, forever. And of course, Lord of the Rings was written back in the 60s. So again, not current, not relevant. It's not what agents are looking for right now, and it's not what editors are looking for right now. So if you're not already, start paying attention to the new releases that are coming out and start reading them actively in your category. Once you have those, then you'll be a little bit better set for this query letter to really stand out and to help showcase your book. Remember, the query letter may be all the chance you get with these agents. This may be the only thing they ever read about your book, and it needs to really shine. You need to give them as many as many tricks and flashy signs to say, hey, read me from everybody else. And those are some ways to do it. The pitch, the accurate word length that's appropriate for the category, and current comparison titles. And then, of course, the last piece that you should include is a little bit of a bio. If you have publication credits like I did on mine, include those. Those are fine. But do not, if you have an education, just a little bit of personal about you is fine. But be careful. If you have published if you have indie published on Amazon, it is not a good idea to include that in your query letter to an agent where you're trying to traditionally publish. You being an independently published can actually be negative. So if your sales are not good as an independently published author and you're trying to get an agent and you tell them that you have an independently published book, they're going to go and look at that book and read the reviews and see how many sales they've got. And they're going to use that possibly as a method to either look at your book or not. So just be very considerate about what you're including in your bio. By all means, do not lie. Do not be like, I have never written a book before, when you have 15 published titles on Amazon that have sold like 4 copies. Like, but you don't need to include that up front. Remember that finding an agent is a lot like going on a date. It's like starting a relationship, and you don't want to reveal all the skeletons in the closet right out the door. So just be very selective about your bio. You don't have to include one if you don't want to. They're not bad, but they're not a negative thing to include either, and it kind of helps fill out the letter a little bit. And also, for the length of your query letter, I recommend using the actual length of a written letter if you were going to print it and mail it, to kind of keep your length in a reasonable size. It's very easy to want to go on and on and on, but use that whatever you can fit reasonably on a normal 8.5 by 11 page typed letter with a 12-inch font and normal margins as how much you can include on your query letter or not. And that also includes kind of the header information. So like your mailing address, the whole standard of the agent's email or their contact at the top, and then your signature block, so on and so forth. The goal here is to be very compact and to not waste a lot of time, and to show that you can bring your story down to a minimal view and still catch their attention. And remember, their attention is very limited, so don't go on and on and on forever. Use the size of that letter to help you determine the size. And again, I will include my original letter, sans of course my mailing address, just for you to compare, so you can kind of see. Actually, if I can, I'll make it downloadable as a PDF or a Word document, so you can actually just take it and redo it. Okay, so we talked about the bio, the word count. Oh, one more thing on the bio. If you have a personal relationship with the agent, it is okay to include that. So if you met Susie at a conference and you had you pitched her a story and she said, hey, that sounds really good, send me an email about it, it is okay to mention that in your letter and say, hey, I met you at so-and-so conference and you were interested in my pitch and I wanted to share it with you. Here you go. That's totally fine. And of course, you can restructure the letter to not start off with a pitch if you want. I do not recommend it. I think that the story should sell itself. And so you should always start off with your story pitch. All right, so that's the kind of overall view on the query letter and what it should include. But now I want to talk about the really, really, really difficult part and the most important part, which of course is the story pitch. So I shared with you what my pitch looked like for the Nightmare Fair, but I wanted to show you a more current process for writing a pitch. So I used my next novel that's coming out. And they're coming out of bookshelves, I believe it should be about within the next year or so, as the synthesis for writing this, because I hadn't written one in so long, and I wanted to remind myself of how hard it was and kind of give you some of the tools for being able to do that. And here's what I've come up with. The first thing is I used what is it's a pretty well-known, it's out there on the internet, a pitch formula. And I'm going to use some of the words that we've talked about in our previous videos. So if you don't recognize what the catalyst is or the outer journey, I recommend going back and looking at those. So the formula is this: when the catalyst happens to the main character, they have to overcome conflict to complete the outer journey. So you're going to use this kind of like a Mad Lib, and you're going to put in the specifics of your story into this formula to kind of get yourself started on the pitch. So taking this formula, I'm going to use my next novel. I'm going to plug in what are more or less the main conflicts, the outer journey, and see what we get. And this is what I came up with. When Mars, a mercenary with a forbidden talent for manipulating the Rift, a magical energy source residing beneath the island of Riven, takes a high-price contract to protect the rich daughter of the man he'd previously been paid to kill, he soon learned she's harboring a dangerous secret that he has every merc in the country hunting for them. A secret that will change the face of Riven itself. Now he must decide if he's willing to risk his freedom and his heart to help her. All right, so let's talk about this formula for a second, and why it's an okay start, but not at all what I would want to share with an agent. And here are some reasons why. First of all, it's really wordy because, I'm writing a fantasy, and fantasy, of course, involves a lot of world building that's specific to the story that people are not going to necessarily recognize right off, like the Rift. The Rift means nothing to you outside of the story. So I have to define what it is, and you have to take those moments to kind of clarify. So as written, it's really wordy. It's also very, very vague in general. So he has to risk his heart. Okay, so is this just purely a romance? And the answer is no, it is not purely a romance. It does have a romantic element, a romance side plot. And, what does it mean to risk, the country, and why is it dangerous? So there's all these questions that get raised by this very simple pitch formula that are not satisfactorily suggested or hinted at. And so the value in the pitch formula is to just get yourself thinking about kind of the broad points of your story that matter. So especially when you're writing fantasy, again, there's lots of world points to consider. There's a lot of side plots. There's a lot of, it's just big. Like we're talking 100,000 word novel here that I'm trying to condense down into 2 paragraphs. So the formula will help you do that by just plugging in the very basics. It will give you a place to start. Then once you've done that, I recommend expanding it and identifying what areas you want to highlight, like what's the most important. Do you want the agent to think this is primarily a romance? Is that what you're going for? Is that your genre? Or do you want it to know, the agent to know that this is a fantasy and this is a high stakes fantasy with magic and fighting and whatever? So you got to kind of use that initial pitch formula to narrow down where it is you want the story to go and to kind of point those things to you. So after having written that, I went back and I said, okay, in my letter, I've got room for 2 paragraphs, which I know because of my previous query letter of the Nightmare Affair, that 2 paragraphs, reasonably sized, is going to fit just fine. It's going to be okay. And actually, we could even go back to the paperback that I showed earlier where there were 3 paragraphs, and that is probably okay too. It's pretty quick. It's reasonable. And I'm not, the reader's not going to get bogged down with a lot of details. And so after having gone through that, let me share with you the updated pitch for my story, which is pretty good. I don't know that it's what I would ultimately use because, to be frank, I probably spent days and days and days revising my my pitch for the Nightmare Affair when I was actually looking for the agent, because of course the high stakes involved. And whereas for this, I'm not going to spend days and days for this video because frankly the book's already been sold, so on and so forth. So just bear that in mind, that revising is still important, especially when we're talking about the query letter. So put time into it, make sure it's exactly what you want, and that make sure that it comes off as a kind of book that you would pick up off the shelf and immediately want to start reading. All right, so given that, here's my revised pitch for my upcoming novel, Riven. On the island of Riven, magic is a luxury of the rich, provided for by the poor souls born with the ability to use it. By age 16, every citizen of Riven is tested for magic, and those discovered with the talent enslaved for it. Only the wealthy can afford to pay off the testers to spare their offspring. Born with the ability, Mars Darksbane escapes this fate thanks to his wealthy benefactor, Una Almadaltra, mistress of a den of mercenaries. With his secret talent, Mars soon becomes the best of Una's mercs, a fate akin to the slavery he would have faced. Now at 19, Mars is desperate for freedom. The chance to escape Una's clutches arrives when he takes a high-priced contract to protect the wealthy heiress, Fura Torvald. Never mind that she's the daughter of a man Mars had previously been paid to assassinate. All he has to do is complete the job, get paid, and get out. But it's easier said than done, for he soon discovers that Fura is harboring a dangerous secret, one that, if revealed, could shatter the political structure of Riven, ending centuries of unjust slavery for people born with magic. Now Mars must decide between his own freedom and freedom for the rest of Riven. All right, so again, maybe not the greatest, and I stumbled over some words here and there. Forgive me, I didn't practice. But the point is that the query hopefully is interesting. It's interesting that the world has this specific setup. I don't go to bog it down with really specific details about the rift and things that you're going to get when you read the story. But the primary emphasis is on the conflict. So, because that is what's going to, not, as we've talked before, that's what gives the story its legs. It's what draws people in. It's what keeps people staying all the way through. So your query letter really needs to focus on the central conflict that the character is going to face and what those risks are. And they want to leave the reader hanging for more. Like, they want to know what happens. So, okay, that is a lot. And we probably got on for a while here. So I'm going to wrap it up. But again, I'm going to include links to my original query letter for you to take a look at. Remember those 4 points that you want to include. Revise your story pitch, and also use your pitch to help you figure out whether or not your book is really ready. So if you're able to do this, write this query letter in this condensed format and meet all these criteria of word count and genre category, and everything in your novel lines up, and you don't have to, hedge on the count or whatever, then your novel's probably in pretty good shape and it probably is ready to go. So you can use the query letter as a litmus test for the rest of the novel. And to be honest, having already gotten past, the agent part in the publishing novels, I still will try and write pitches like this to when I'm pre-writing my next novel, to kind of give myself an idea of where it's going, and to, give me, it's kind of that litmus test again to make sure that I'm on the right track with the conflict and where it's going, and so on and so forth. All right, guys, good luck writing your query letters. If you have questions about them, if you want me to, maybe take a look at one or two, feel free to email me. I might have time for a couple. Otherwise, I want you to write with intent, live with intent, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.